Thank you. Hello, everyone. As you may have heard, I'm Nicholas, and I work on Google Chrome as part of the web identity team. You can see our cute logo there. So today I'm going to talk about the FedCM API. I will explain the current shape of the API, and I will introduce some future improvements that the team has been working on. And then at the end, there will be time for questions and discussion. So in Federation, the user authenticates to a relying party, or RP, via existing user credentials from an identity provider, or IDP. So some examples of identity providers are there in this slide. So Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub. So why should we care about federated identity? Well, as was already mentioned before, passwords suck. And so why do they suck? Well, a user that uses a new password on every site is sort of a problem for several reasons. First, a lot of users, the vast majority of users, do not actually use password managers. And there may be reasons they don't trust the password managers, or they simply don't know how to use them, etc. But the fact is they don't use them, and so as such, it's likely that multiple sites will get the same user password, right? Because the user has to actually remember the password. So if a site is breached, for example, then that means that the user credentials, not just on that site, but also on many other sites, are now vulnerable. And so that is an issue. Now, when a user uses Federation, they do not need to create a new password. The account creation becomes very easy because the user just needs to consent for the IDP to send the relevant information about the user to the RP, and then the account is magically created on the backend. So this convenience makes Federation a good candidate for us to help users to not use passwords whenever possible. Since the user can log into the IDP in any other device, the accounts created via Federation are very transferable across devices. And so all of this makes Federation very universally accessible and very convenient for users. So as such, it is a good tool for us to help towards a future without passwords, or at least with less passwords than nowadays. So now that we saw the importance of Federation, let's talk about why we had to have the user agent Chrome involved here. So as you are probably aware, Chrome is planning on phasing out third-party cookies by the end of 2024. Now, in the world of federated identity, this does not present challenges to lots of flows because a lot of them use full page redirects. But it does affect flows that use iframes, right? Because the iframes will have to use the cookies from the IDP. So in particular, it does present a problem to a widget like the one that you see in the slide, where it's basically an iframe with the IDP cookie that is letting the user use the IDP account information to sign into the RP. So without third-party cookies, such an iframe is no longer possible, right? The IDP wouldn't know what information, like the IDP doesn't know what user account to show, so they cannot possibly present this iframe to the user. So to address that gap, we did an origin trial of the FedCM API. So the API works by requiring the IDP to expose some endpoints, such as the accounts endpoint and the ID token endpoint. So basically, those are endpoints that the browser uses to fetch information about the user and about the RP. Now, the RP would generally embed a JavaScript SDK that is provided by the IDP, and that SDK would invoke the FedCM API. By using a third-party SDK, the API can be activated with little to no change from the RP, right? All that happens is that the IDP would update that SDK. When the API is invoked, the endpoints are fetched in order to gather the required information from the IDP. So, for example, the RP privacy policy, the terms of service, as well as the accounts that the user is currently logged into. If the user goes through the flow and chooses to sign into the RP, then the RP and IDP learn that this user with certain IDP credentials has decided to visit the RP, and then the IDP can provide the ID token to the RP, and then the RP can use that token to create the account on that RP site for the user. If instead the user chooses to close the dialog from the browser, then the RP and the IDP should not learn that the user with these IDP credentials has visited this RP. So in particular, the RP should not learn about the user credentials from the IDP, and the IDP should not learn about the RP that is being visited by this specific user. During the urgent trial, we partnered with the Google Identity Services team to test the API, and it was tested on about 20 websites and across 300,000 users. So we're happy to announce that the urgent trial was successful, and we recently launched the API in Chrome 108. So what this means is that as stable rolls out to 108, which will happen towards the end of this month, the FedCM API will be available to any site. So they won't require an urgent trial token, and they won't have constraints on the number of users that can access the API. So we encourage IDPs to try it out and provide us feedback. The sample code in the slide shows how you would invoke the API. So it's very simple. It's a single JavaScript call. And even though the API is launched, we do want to caution that it is far from being in a finalized state. And in fact, we do anticipate to do some breaking changes on the API before third-party cookie phase out. In terms of interop, other browser engines are supportive of the FedCM API. We think they're supportive because it provides the federated login capabilities in a privacy-friendly way, right? Not requiring third-party cookies. So the screenshot on this slide shows the positive position from Mozilla. But I'd also like to point out we've been collaborating closely with them on the API design, and they have also started prototyping the FedCM API. So overall, we think that the API has a high chance of becoming largely interoperable across browsers, and that will provide a good and consistent experience for users and developers. Now I'm going to talk about what we've been working on, so things that have not launched, but the things that we want to see launching in the future. So first, one major constraint of FedCM as shipped in 108 is that it supports only a single IDP. So the browser dialog can only show accounts from one IDP. Now, we want to allow users to choose from more than one IDP, as is reflected in the mock slide there, because, well, a user can likely be signed in to more than one from the IDPs that a given RP would support for federated login. So the API to achieve this is work in progress, and the main hurdle here is to ensure that IDPs can remain fairly isolated, right? I mentioned we want them to be using their JavaScript SDKs that the RPs can just embed. So they should be fairly isolated, but they should be able to collaborate in some degree, because their API calls would end up in the same browser dialog, right? A browser dialog that contains multiple IDPs. So that has been the main hurdle. And so another thing we are actively looking for is actual IDP partners who could help us test our API designs. So if you're an IDP that's interested, please feel free to reach out to us. And yeah, I won't go into much more detail because there was already lightning talk by my teammate Zach. So if you missed it, then feel free to check out the recording of that. Now, another improvement we've been working on, which is why I mentioned about backwards incompatible changes, is what we call the IDP sign-in status API. So in order to talk about that, first, let me explain what we call the silent tracking problem. Basically, imagine that you are eviltracker.com and you want to use FedCM to keep tracking users, even though you live in a world where you cannot use third-party cookies to do so. So EvilTracker will essentially call FedCM, as in the example there, and by doing that, they will be able to have the browser perform some fetches to the tracker. So the tracker is going to receive some browser fetches. So in particular, there are two fetches relevant here. The client or RP metadata fetch, that is what fetches the privacy policy and terms of service. And of course, that requires telling the IDP who is the RP, right? Then the other important fetch is the accounts fetch. So obviously, to know the user accounts in the IDP, you need to send a credentialed fetch, right? You need to know the cookies from the IDP. So those will be, that one will be a credentialed fetch. And so the EvilTracker will learn the RP from the client metadata fetch, and they will learn a signature, like let's say a unique identifier from the user, right? Because they can set that in their first-party cookie. So they will learn the RP, they will learn an identifier for the user. Now, those fetches happen very close in time, right? Because this is needed to produce the browser UI. So EvilTracker will correlate the fetches that occur close in time, they will match them up. And by doing so, they will be able to guess that the user with the given unique ID has visited rp.example. And even worse, the EvilTracker will be like, okay, I don't have accounts for this user. And so currently, the FedCM API will just not show anything if there are no accounts. So the tracker has now been able to essentially keep tracking the user by using the FedCM API. Now, the way we're trying to tackle this problem is by using the IDP sign-in status API. So what this means is that the IDP will tell the browser when the user is logged in, and they will also tell the browser when the user has logged out. Now, this allows us to only perform fetches for the accounts list when the IDP has told us that the user is logged in, right? Because if it's logged out, then we can just be like, okay, there's no accounts, so no need to show the dialog. And if it happens that the IDP has told us that the user is logged in, but we receive no fetches, well, first of all, that should be like a rare occurrence, right? Because it means the IDP kind of lied to us, or there was some inconsistency there. But second of all, it lets us show a more meaningful dialogue to the user if that happens, right? If it is the case that the IDP said the user is logged in, but then when we tried to fetch the accounts, there were actually no accounts. So in that case, we can show a dialogue to allow the IDP sign in from the user, right? Because we know for a fact that the user is actually not logged into the IDP. So this is where the IDP sign-in dialog comes into play. It lets us show something meaningful to the user when they are actually not logged in, but the IDP thought that they were. So this is the IDP sign-in flow. It would look, these are mocks that look similar to some existing, I think, payment handler API that shows dialogue that is basically like some website that was navigated to, and you can do inputs on it. And so essentially the user would sign in that dialogue. And then once they have signed in, they can continue to use the FedCM bubble on the right. And I should point out that this IDP sign-in dialog can also be used in other scenarios like multi-IDP. So for example, let's say you're logged into your Google account, but not your Facebook account. There can be an option to be like, well, sign in with a different IDP. And so in that case, if the user wants to actually use Facebook as their IDP, well, I'm not saying Facebook is using this API, by the way, in case, because there's Facebook people here, but this is hypothetical. So let's say they want to use Facebook. Now that IDP sign-in flow lets the user sign into Facebook first through the dialog and then use FedCM to do federated login with the RP. Now, something else we've been working on is iframe support. So there are RPs that would like to embed IDP scripts in a cross-origin iframe. The reason for this is perhaps encapsulation of the login code or even security, right? Because if you embed your third-party IDP script in your top-level frame, then that script can basically do whatever they want with your page. In any case, the RP will embed the cross-origin iframe, like RP login.example, and that iframe will invoke the FedCM API. This is currently not supported because the FedCM API is pretty powerful. So by default, cross-origin iframes do not have access to the API. But we are working on enabling this via permissions policy. So that means that the top-level frame will need to give explicit permission to the cross-origin iframe. And once that permission has been granted, then the cross-origin iframe can invoke the FedCM API directly. Besides embedding an iframe to encapsulate logic, another potential use case of this is iframes that actually require user authentication. However, we do not currently have any specific use cases for iframes requiring authentication that could actually benefit specifically from FedCM. So if you do have such use case, then please reach out to the team. Something else we're working on, and it is an existing capability that will break with third-party cookie phase-out, is personalized buttons. So I would imagine most of you have seen these on the web, right? Because they are already something that exists. It is basically showing returning users that they can log into this RP with the credential that they probably have used in the past from the given IDP. We are working on an API that would enable the IDP to query the relevant information that is needed in order to create such personalized button. So for example, they might need the name of the RP account as well as the email address or some picture, etc. And that will enable the IDP to recreate personalized buttons, but without us completely dictating how they should look like. And currently, IDPs do allow the user to log out of the RPs that have used federated login, and they allow it from the IDP site. This is what we call front channel logout. And this is possible via iframes and third-party cookies. So we're also working on enabling front channel logouts via FedCM, in particular for federated login that uses the FedCM API. We want to enable the IDP to be able to perform similar front channel logouts to what they do nowadays. Now, even though there are a lot of benefits to FedCM, it does have some downsides as well. For instance, if you're using your IDP account to log in everywhere, then now that means your IDP knows a lot about you. So it is not privacy friendly in terms of the information you exchange with the IDP. Additionally, if you now lose your account from that IDP, then you are in a lot of trouble, right? Because you used it in so many places. So now what's going to happen with all those accounts? And it's even the case that some RPs, like for example, banks, would probably not consider using federated login just because it transfers some of the account security responsibilities to the IDP instead of being like a first-party responsibility. So as you may also have heard earlier, there are other ways in which we are working towards a future with less passwords. And one of those ways is the WebAuthn API. So as a recap, the WebAuthn API uses passkeys. And while both of these APIs are shipped, they have, like right now, they are largely independent from one another. So we need to explore ways to ensure that the two work well together and integrate them so that users can seamlessly log into sites, but without overwhelming them with options. As the web evolves to a more privacy-friendly landscape for users, the web identity team has also been thinking about ways in which it can help share only the right amount of data. So there may be scenarios where the RP only needs to know a limited amount of information about the user, such as perhaps whether they are over a certain age. Like, let's say the user wants to purchase something that requires being like over 21, for example. So they will not necessarily need to know the name and the email and basically everything about the user. So the team is thinking about designing an API that enables this granularity in terms of sharing, so that the RP can choose to only request a specific amount of information from the user. So this is work in progress, but there is quite a bit of demand for it, especially for IDPs that already have some level of granular sharing capabilities. And so we're excited to help in this aspect. And yeah, that brings us to the end of the presentation. And there is the team contact information, since I did mention reach out to us like 20 times in the presentation. So in case you actually want to reach out. So yeah, now it's time for questions and discussion.
So regarding the extra details, like page address, is this like user controlled for each RP, or like the willingness to expose those details to a particular site, is that something that the user control, or?
Yeah, so I believe it would probably be, there's already something called claims that has a lot of fields that you can expose. And some of those might be required, like the RP might say, oh, I actually fundamentally need these from the user. And so, I mean, obviously the user can always decline, but then the RP will be like, well, then I can't do this for you. And we like, and some of them may be like optional, right? So I think we need to learn more about the space to see what works for RPs, as well as, well, what IDPs are currently doing right now, because we don't want it to be a scenario where the RP just says, oh, I want everything and it is all required all the time. So it ends up being a less privacy-friendly world just because they can ask for more information, right? So we don't want to end in there, but it's going to be tricky, right? Because, like, what is the incentive for RPs to not request all the information?
Yeah, okay.
Related to how this interoperates with passkeys and WebAuthn, is there like some support for maybe starting with a federated login and then transitioning to a passkey as my authentication method, or binding the two together? I know sometimes I've started off with like a password login and then done a more federated login, and some sites handle that okay, some don't. So I'm wondering if you have ideas about how to handle that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the TL of the team actually suggested something like what you said, where it's like, let's make it so that you can use federated, but then for sites that support it, it would then request, like you would just request the passkey right after you log in with your federated credentials. And that way you get kind of some of benefits from both, where it's like super easy to log in, but then it's also like with all the benefits from just having to use a passkey going forward, because, well, if you don't, then the IDP will also learn every time you visit this site, right? Because you're going to have to log in again and again. So that is something, that is a good idea. And it's, we don't have anything concrete built out right now, but I think it's a good path to explore and see if RPs would actually adopt it.
Riley has her hand up.
Yeah, I was curious. You know, like a lot of this is dependent on IDPs and RPs adopting. I know you just ran an origin trial, and so the question is like, how quickly do you anticipate that this is going to be the way that federated login works on the web?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is not that quickly, just because a lot of federated login goes through full page redirects. And, well, Chrome at least, like we don't currently have a great solution to cracking down on tracking via redirects. So it would be really hard to break that. And as such, a lot of IDPs can still work with full page redirects. Now, in terms of IDPs that use like the login bubbles, right now our main partner, as I mentioned, is the Google Identity Services team. And we're hopeful that other IDPs see this dialogue, see how easy it is to implement for themselves, and will potentially reach out to us to be like, I want to be in that dialogue as well. But I think my answer is it's as far away as link decoration, so it's far. All right. Thanks, everyone.